right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Sorry about that. There's a couple technical issues there getting started. But good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining my talk. My name is Zuly Gonzalez, and I'm going to talk to you today about malware and how that can impact your online investigations and research activities, and how you can protect yourself while you're on the web. So we'll just dig right into it, and I was told to remind you guys in the beginning to, if you're using the mobile app, to use the feedback mechanism built into the app. So just before we dive in, to give you a little background on myself, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Techno Security, and at Techno Security we pioneered the concept of remote browser isolation, which is really a way to provide malware-free and anonymous web browsing. Prior to Techno Security, I spent over a decade at the NSA. I started my career as an engineer protecting our information security systems from bad guys breaking in. And then I later transitioned to program manager, where I managed multi-million-dollar projects. I'd say probably one of the most rewarding things that I did while I was there at NSA was being the program manager for our counter-IED efforts, and it was really rewarding to see our efforts directly impacting the lives that we were able to save of our combat men and women overseas. All right, so just to kind of lay the groundwork here and go through a couple of basic topics, just to summarize. The focus of the talk, as I mentioned, is malware, and basically malware is a fancy way of saying malicious software. And malicious software is really just any type of software that's doing something on your computer that's unwanted, something that you don't want the software to be doing. Another commonly used term that's less correct but used quite frequently is computer virus. And really, computer virus is a type of malware, but it's not the broader category. Most cybercrime today has some sort of malware component somewhere along the chain. A cyber criminal can, use malware, maybe not to get into your bank account specifically, but they'll use the malware to grab your, username and password, and then use that to get into your bank account and, withdraw money. As far as malware as a threat, really it needs to be able to execute on your computer in order to really cause any harm. And this is known as remote code execution, which really means, as in kind of like the cyber criminal taking over your computer and running his malware on your computer. If you keep the malware from running on your computer, then the malware can't harm you, it can't hurt you. But if the malware does achieve that remote code execution, then basically you have to consider that computer is fully compromised. It's think of it as the computer is now the bad guy's, the hacker's computer, and he's basically just letting you use it, or not in the case of something like ransomware, where they're preventing you from accessing your data. So 85% of all malware is spread through web browsers, and that really takes into account things like malicious email. So if you receive an email with a link in it, that malicious link is going to lead you to a website. So in that case, really the malware is coming from the malicious website, not the email itself that you received. And the more and more that you learn about typical network defenses, then the more you realize that really web browsers are really the ideal mechanism and way for malware to get in. And we'll talk in the coming slides more about that here. So why the web browser? There's a few reasons why the web browser is really the preferred method into a network. The first one is pretty simple. Basically, the web browser is the most commonly used business application today, so it really gives the bad guys an incentive to go after that, since so many folks are using it all the time. Second, almost every network you could think of out there has perimeter defenses that really keep the bad guys from just kind of strolling on into the network. This means that an attacker can't just kind of from the outside, can't get into your perimeter and just start launching attacks directly on the computers on the inside. But the core design of how a web browser works, it's really intended to go outside of your network, go grab that untrusted code, and then bring it back into the network and execute it within your network. And this is really the most dangerous action that a computer program can perform. Now, if the web browser were perfect, it'd be able to do that in a safe way, but it's not. So that's why we have these issues. It just can't do so in a perfect way, in a safe way. So this really brings us to that third reason there of why browsers are such a common way to get into your network. And that is that web browsers are extremely complex, which really makes them inherently dangerous or inherently difficult to secure. Web browsers have hundreds of vulnerabilities and bugs, and really it just takes one to bypass all of your network security and network defenses. People use web browsers all day long to bring that untrusted code that's hosted externally into the network, and really then that means that the hackers and the cyber criminals challenge focuses to figuring out ways to get you to land on malicious websites where they can then leverage that browser and break into your network. So let's talk a little bit about how exactly you can get malware from your web browser. There's two ways to do that. One is through downloads, and one is through just browser vulnerabilities. So malware through a download is the simplest method for an attacker, but it's also the most easily avoided by the victims. The hackers then use lots of tricks to try and disguise their malware as something that you really want to download and voluntarily download and execute on your network. So we have a few examples here to kind of show that. In this example here, we have an attacker trying to trick the victim into targeting or into downloading malware that's disguised as a media player plugin or update. The bad guys are really good at convincing users to take action, basically by trying to use strong emotional and kind of psychological responses from the user. In these examples here, we have two different ones. One claims that Chuck Norris died, and the other one is claiming that it's a Katy Perry sex tape. So if the victim clicks on that link there to try and download that update or that plugin, they're instead of being able to see that sex tape, they're going to be really disappointed when they realize, oh wait a minute, I just downloaded some malware. And kind of speaking to that emotional kind of psychological response that the bad guys are really great at leveraging. They're always watching for big national news, things like, for example, the Olympics or like the big massive hurricanes that we had last year, and then really trying to create malware campaigns around those events. Because that's something that people are out there searching for, looking for that type of information. So it's a big draw for them to kind of pay attention to the news and see what's going on. So this example here is a scareware example. Here the attackers attempting to trick the victim into downloading malware by claiming that the victim already has malware, and they're being nice enough to try to help you clean it up. This one's also interesting because if for some reason the cyber criminal fails at getting the user to download the malware by clicking on that button there to download, they have a fallback mechanism, and basically they provide the victim with a support number there so that the victim can call, and their super helpful support staff will walk the victim through how to download the malware step by step. This is another scareware example, but in this case here, the attacker makes it look like it's the Firefox browser that's detected something on the system, and of course, obviously, Firefox doesn't do that. That's not something that Firefox does, but they're able to make it look that way, and then trying to encourage the user to download the malware by clicking on that Start Protection button there. This is a phishing email example. In this case here, the attacker's trying to convince the CFO to think that this is a legitimate email coming from the CEO asking to do a wire transfer. And the wiring instructions that come with this can easily be like an attached document that, if opened by the CFO, then installs malware on the computer. So then looping back to what we were talking about in terms of how malware is introduced into your network, the second method of getting malware into your network is through an exploit of a vulnerability in your browser that'll install malware in a way that requires no user interaction or knowledge or permission at all. It just happens silently in the background. It takes a more sophisticated attacker to get away with this, but if they can pull it off, it can be pretty devastating. All the attacker has to do is basically lure anybody to their own malicious website that they've developed, and then simply landing on that web page is enough to infect the computer. No download or interaction, again, is needed by the user in this case. Here, this graph is just showing a number of the discovered vulnerabilities that allow that remote code execution in the main 4 browsers here, and this is from last year. And these are just the ones that the good guys found and reported, but when you think about it, there's really many more out there that only the bad guys know about, and they're leveraging, and they're just out there, or countless others that are out there and nobody knows about yet, and it's just a matter of who's going to find it first. Is it going to be the good guys? Is it going to be the bad guys? And trying to stay protected from those vulnerabilities. So now we know how we get browser-based malware. I thought it'd be good to kind of talk about the effects that malware can have once it actually gets a foothold onto your network. So the keylogger, that's one of the oldest types of malware. A keylogger will just kind of silently sit on your computer and log all the keystrokes that are pressed on that keyboard. And then send that information back to the cyber criminal. This type of malware is really easy. It's extremely easy to write and can have a pretty nice payoff for the attacker, even if they don't get into your bank account or in terms of getting their credentials for your bank account. They might still be able to, for example, get your email credentials, get your email password. And that may be enough for them to then be able to reset your bank account password or any other type of login password and login account, and then use that as a way in. Using something like a 2-factor authentication will defeat a lot of this password stealing stuff that's out there. But if you've got a keylogger on your computer, the keylogger's still there. It's still able to record all of these keystrokes. So, maybe they don't get into your bank account, but again, they can see all the keystrokes. So writing emails, for example, they'll be able to see that, and depending on what you're doing, that could be pretty bad. It could be, very damaging. It could be embarrassing. Who knows? So it's still a matter of that information getting out in some way. Ransomware is the malware, the type of malware that's been getting all the press lately these past few years. Ransomware will encrypt all the files on your computers, you guys know, and then demand that you pay a ransom in order for them to unencrypt all the files. It's really a pretty big business right now. Ransomware is because it's extremely attractive for the attackers. Victims are sending them, hundreds and thousands of dollars, and it's very scalable because a single attacker can pretty much infect millions of users and be getting payments from millions of users all at the same time. If we look at some of the statistics from the Justice Department, for example, they say that there are about 4,000 malware attacks every day, and that it's the fastest growing type of malware out there. Since not everybody that's infected with ransom is making that public and letting the world know that they were infected, it's really kind of impossible to put an exact number on the damages that have resulted from ransomware, but it's estimated to be kind of over $5 billion, and that was back in 2017, and that's up from $1 billion in 2016. So that amount doesn't take into account only the ransom payments. It's taking into account other things, other indirect costs like cleaning up after the malware, remediation, other types of costs like downtime. So ransomware it's a lot more complicated to create and develop than something like a keylogger, but now there's something called ransomware as a service, which really makes ransomware accessible to just about anybody. You don't need skills to get into the game now, if you will. For less than like $200, even like a 16-year-old kid with no knowledge or no experience can buy a ransomware kit on the dark web and start infecting victims. And the good news of that is, although the ransomware has become more easily accessible to folks, it also means that the average quality of ransomware has decreased. And then that's allowed a lot of security companies to now be able to create and distribute free decryptors that they can pass along to the victims, so they don't have to pay the ransom in order to get their files back. If you are infected with ransomware, the best way to recover as quickly as possible is to make sure that you have backups, have all your important files backed up. The important thing to know or kind of keep in mind is that your backups have to be located somewhere where that ransomware can't access it, because obviously if they access it, then they're going to encrypt your backup, and your backups are then useless at that point. So another kind of big money-making type of malware is banking malware. Banking malware is more sophisticated than a keylogger. It's more focused than a keylogger. Instead of just catching everything that's going on, all the keystrokes that are happening on your computer, it's sitting there and attaching itself to your computer's browser and really waiting to see that you're going to be logging into a bank account. And once it detects that the user's trying to log into a bank account, then it's going to kind of silently grab a copy of your credentials and then send that back to the malware author. More sophisticated banking malware can even do this in a way that beats two-factor authentication, so it can be pretty devastating. And obviously the end goal there is to grab that information so that it can get into your bank accounts and drain your bank account. Banking malware can be more attractive to attackers than ransomware for a couple of reasons. One is that it's not up to the victim to pay. If they get into your bank account, they can take your money. They don't need to ask you for a payment. And the second is that if they're in your bank account, they can potentially get a lot more money from one single victim than that one victim would be willing to pay in a ransom to get their files back. This chart here shows some of the common ones that are common exploits for banking malware, and Zeus is one of the most common and kind of successful ones. And just between like 2007 and 2010, it stole over $100 million. Dridex is another example, and that one made over $40 million just in like 2015 alone.
Can you speak briefly how they're defeating two-factor?
Yeah, so sure, because they're kind of tying into your web page there. So basically, kind of the flow, if you look at it, it would be they're on your computer. They see that the user's trying to log into a banking website. They've created their own banking website, malicious site that looks exactly like the original. they give you that malicious website. You type in your credentials, they then take that information, redirect it to the original banking site. The original banking site either logs you in, or in the case where you have two-factor authentication, send that, that text message to the user's phone. The user gets their code, they type that code into I'll say the website sees that, the malicious website sees that, presents the user with a, hey, type in your code. Then the user gets the code on their phone, types the code into that malicious website. That malicious website redirects to the original, which logs them in, and they've got all the information there that they need. So it's because they're kind of a man in the middle there. They can see that information. Another example here, this is a common one, is zombies, the botnet zombie. Really, this is where an infection takes over and then makes your computer part of a botnet. A botnet is really just a collection of computers spread across the world, all connected through the internet, being controlled by the bot master. Most of the time, the bot army is just kind of laying dormant, not doing much of anything. But at any given time, the bot master can, call upon its army of computers and ask that it do all kinds of stuff, like launch DDoS attacks. I'd say probably most of you guys are probably familiar with, botnets being used for DDoS attacks, but they're not limited to just that. They can do all kinds of other stuff. For example, it can be used as a covert channel to store and distribute illegal content, even going as far as doing things like using your computer to store child pornography and things like that. So it can be pretty bad. This one's interesting too. Crypto mining malware is it's one of the newest threats. And it's kind of interesting because it shows just how creative these bad guys, the cyber criminals, are when it comes to monetizing their efforts. Crypto miners don't actually steal your money or steal credential information or anything like that. Instead, they're just kind of sitting silently on your computer and consuming your system's processing power to mine cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, for example. And that could sound kind of lame, pretty lame, but surprisingly, it's making them a lot of money, making them millions of dollars. The harm from the victim's perspective really comes mostly in the fact that your computer gets really sluggish and slow because all the processing power is being used by the malware, and it'll cause like your electric bill to go up and things like that. And this one's also interesting for another reason as well. Not only does it work like the standard malware that we've been talking about, where it infects the victim's computer, but it can do its work without actually infecting the victim's computer and actually executing malware on that computer. The crypto mining can be done entirely in JavaScript, and that means that it doesn't, as I mentioned, doesn't really need to infect the victim's computer. It can do this really in the background, as long as the victim is on a web page that the criminal has control over. Once that victim closes the browser or moves away from that page, then that's all over with though. So it's not as persistent as traditional malware, but it can still be done while that victim's on that web page. So the goal then becomes for the attackers of trying to develop sites that will keep people on those sites for longer periods of time. Maybe some of those really addictive games and things like that people are just doing for hours. So far we've kind of discussed pretty common malware that's really untargeted and is designed to attack the broadest group possible without really directing that malware towards a specific individual or a specific group. But then when we start talking about kind of more of the targeted malware, we kind of get into a whole different category of threats. These threats are more likely to target intellectual property or your sensitive or confidential information, rather than just trying to get into your bank account. And the malware is usually less automated in these cases. really what happens is this type of malware allows the author to get into your computer, get into your system, and kind of browse around and check around and see what's going on your computer, look around and see whatever it is that he's looking for and kind of find it. This is usually the type of malware that very sophisticated attackers use, something like like nation states, for example. So when you talk about nation state, they're looking for things like finding top secret military information and things like that. But an average attacker can use malware to target specifically whoever it is that maybe has gotten on their bad side. And so, we kind of look at the folks in this room here for you guys. Imagine if you're the criminals that you're investigating basically turned the tables on you, and now they're inside of your network and accessing all of your information, everything that you've gathered on them during the course of your investigation, during the course of your case. They've got access to all of that. Maybe even getting their hands on a source or an informant, name of a source or informant or something like that. Obviously that would be pretty dangerous and could have some serious repercussions. Not only will they have access to all the information that's on that computer, but once in your computer, they can also start kind of hopping around, going from computer to computer on your network, and find whatever it is that they're looking for. If they're looking for something specific, they can just go around until they find what they're looking for. So once an attacker's inside of your system, not only can they steal that sensitive information and documents that we were talking about, but they can also do things, as you guys know, like turn on your microphone and webcam. Obviously, besides that just being plain old creepy and just it can have some pretty devastating effects for law enforcement as well. Imagine if these criminals that you're investigating are recording everything that's being done and said in your office. They can even see your face and listen to all the phone calls that you're making from your desk. So done with all kind of the scary talk of malware. Let's kind of shift gears now to talk a little bit more about kind of how you can protect yourself from all these different online threats that we've just talked about. So when we think of online malware protection, the first and kind of obvious one that most people think about is antivirus software, and that's actually really interesting. As soon as I said that, you guys can't see it here, but a little pop-up came up that says something about antivirus software. Perfect timing. So there's really a ton of different antivirus products out there, but they all kind of basically work the same way. They scan your computer for files that match signatures of known malware. And up until about kind of a decade ago, Antivirus did a pretty good job of providing protection. The antivirus vendors were able to mostly keep up and find and develop signatures for new malware as fast as the malware was being created and developed. And some did slip through the cracks, but for the most part, it was pretty good. I know it's probably really hard to see here, but in this graph, if you can, probably around that point there where it starts going up, that was 2007, and that's when things really started to drastically change and kind of shift. Suddenly malware kind of creation started accelerating, and it's kind of slowly at first, but then faster and faster each year, and then by 2013 there, it completely went beyond the ability of antivirus software, antivirus vendors to keep up. And just to kind of give you a little perspective there on the scale, there were over 120 million new malware variants that were created in 2017. That's over 300,000 per day, or about 4 different variants that were created in every second in that year. with malware authors now having that ability to create so much new malware, it really makes it really hard for the malware vendors to kind of keep up. And I kind of skipped there. Okay. Another common defense is secure web gateways, which really are commonly referred to as web proxies. The goal of the products here with web proxies is to keep users away from websites that might be dangerous, might be considered dangerous. This approach has numerous problems to be kind of aware of, especially for kind of folks in this room here that are doing a lot of research and investigations online and going to just a lot of unknown websites. The first is that the only real protection that proxies can provide is to block access to a known bad website, known malicious site. If it's similar to antivirus, if it doesn't know about a newly created malicious site, it can't block that site, it can't block you from accessing that site. And because of this, a lot of organizations now kind of resort to not just blocking the known malicious sites, but blocking unknown sites, which is basically a site that is not known whether it's safe or not. And then that's where that leads to problems for folks that are doing a lot of research and investigations online, because you're probably going to come across a lot of websites that you need to access to do your research but aren't able to because it's an unknown site and it's being blocked. Something else to consider, again, especially targeting towards the audience here, is that sometimes you do need to access a known malicious site for whatever reason as part of your investigation. But if you override that proxy to then allow you to access that site, that proxy can't provide any protection at all for that malicious site. So once you're on the site, you can be easily compromised because there's no additional security there. And then the third thing to kind of keep in mind is that at any given time, most of the sites that are spreading malware aren't sites that are designed to be malicious, but pretty legitimate, trusted sites that have been either hacked or have been kind of tricked into showing malicious ads. And then this can happen not just with smaller kind of hobby sites, but also large, legitimate, big sites. So things like Yahoo, MSN, YouTube can have this problem where they're now spreading malware. So even blocking access to everything except those most trusted sites still leaves you kind of exposed on the internet. I skipped two here. Antivirus and proxies are really kind of the two most common products and methods used for defending against web-based malware, but they have a lot of shortcomings, but at least they provide some level of protection. These next couple I wanted to talk about really, really briefly because they don't provide any protection at all from web-based malware, though a lot of people mistakenly think that they do. And they do a great job, these solutions do a great job at what they were designed to do, but malware protection is not one of those things that they were actually designed to do. So the first is Tor Browser, which I'm guessing some of you in this room probably use. It's used commonly in research environments. And again, it's great at protecting your identity online and keeping websites from knowing that it's user that's accessing those sites. But it's not designed for malware protection, so it really can't provide any malware protection to the user when you're using it. So you have to use it with caution. Same thing applies to the browser's incognito or private browsing mode. It may cover your track so that your browsing history and your logs aren't exposed, but again, no malware protection. And although unrelated to malware protection, something else that I wanted to kind of just mention really quickly is that a lot of folks also kind of mistakenly think that the incognito mode makes you anonymous online, but that's not true. It really doesn't. All it's doing is really preventing the browser from saving your cookies and cache files and browsing history so that someone that accesses your system can't see your browsing history, but it doesn't do anything to prevent websites that you're accessing from seeing your IP address or any other identifying information about you. So again, something to use for its purpose, but use with caution and make sure you have other security layers to provide the malware protection when you're using these solutions. So finally, to kind of wrap up, I wanted to close the talk with some of the newer and more kind of effective methods of protecting you from web-based malware. The first is a virtual machine. You can create a virtual machine on your computer and then do all of your browsing within that virtual machine, so that it's happening in that virtual machine instead of directly on your computer. But one thing to do is that to be sure that you're not getting malware all the time and that from session to session things are getting polluted, if you will, is that you have to regularly reset that virtual machine to a known safe snapshot, so that each time you're getting a clean image and there's no kind of tampering from the previous session. Virtual machine is a pretty solid method for preventing malware and protecting yourself, but it's got a couple of just kind of drawbacks to keep in mind. First, it's a little tedious for the average user, so it's not something that every user is going to want to do. And starting up a virtual machine and resetting it to that known safe snapshot can take several minutes. So again, most of us are a little impatient and just not a huge drawback, but something to keep in mind. Also, virtual machines, probably the biggest one, is that they take up a lot of resources on your computer, so it could kind of slow down your whole system when you're using it. And other applications outside of that virtual machine may feel sluggish just beyond the browsing itself. Lastly, it is possible for malware to escape that VM by basically kind of launching very specialized attacks on that virtualization software, or it could just start launching network-based attacks and try to attack other computers on that network that's connected to the computer you're using. Another method that we see that's, effective is the use of Chromebooks. So if you're not familiar, Chromebooks is just a pretty inexpensive laptop, and it allows you to do pretty much just like web browsing. Because it's extremely limited in its functionality, it's not installing software, it's not modifying the core OS. It's very hard for malware to infect the system in a way that's lasting and permanent. So again, Chromebooks do a pretty good job of defending against malware. Really the biggest malware threat that comes with using a Chromebook is really from a malicious extension that you're going to download from the Chrome store. But those are a lot easier to kind of know and see and avoid as compared to something like a malicious site or drive-by download. The biggest downside to this method is kind of the cost and the user experience. Chromebooks are inexpensive laptops, but they're still a few $100s each. So if you're going to have organization where you're going to be protecting several thousand or several dozens of users or something like that, it could cost over $10,000 to implement. And then the user needs to be trained and remember that when they're doing this type of browsing, they need to go to their Chromebook and do that browsing and then use their normal workstation for everything else, other browsing as well as their normal day-to-day job. And then finally, the last approach is remote browser isolation. And obviously, I'm a little biased here because that's the technology that our company pioneered, but hopefully you guys can also kind of see the benefit that it provides and how it can potentially kind of eradicate this web-based malware problem. Just out of curiosity, has anybody heard of browser isolation in the room? Okay.
Browser isolation, yeah.
Okay, so a couple. Browser isolation, but not remote. Okay. So the concept's really very similar to using the virtual machine approach that that I talked about earlier, but without those downsides. So instead of running the browser in that heavy VM that's running on your desktop in your network, the browser is moved out of your network and completely running in the cloud. That lets the user access any website that they want without any of that website content. That's where the malware is, or where it's coming from, reaching your network. And this can be done right inside of your normal browser, right on your workstation, so it doesn't have those high hardware costs and kind of usability issues that like a Chromebook would have. There's some additional benefits to using this type of technology beyond the malware protection itself. For example, you can define things like browser policies that prevent users from being able to just download any software, any piece of software, and kind of restrict it based on the type of file and where that file is being downloaded from. So you can put some restrictions there. This is also nice because a lot of those social engineering kind of examples that we talked about that are trying to trick users into downloading malware would be stopped, because even if the user gets tricked into trying to download it, this will then put a stop to that attack. And then lastly, I'd say probably another nice thing is that it adds a pretty powerful layer of anonymity on top of your web browsing. So hopefully for you guys, kind of the main takeaway from the talk is that, yes, web-based malware is it's a huge problem and something to be aware of, but there's some new technologies out there that can help you stay protected as you're doing your online research and investigation, something more than just your traditional approaches. So thank you for your time. Again, I hope you guys learned something. I'm happy to take any questions. Any questions? No? Okay, well, thank you guys. And again, don't forget to use the mobile app if you're using it and rate the session. Thank you.